My name is John Hartley, and if I'm known for anything, it's really in the field of media studies and cultural studies rather than in the study of children directly. But I came to children as one of the audience types for popular media. And I wasn't really interested in individual children's behavior, and I'm not a trained psychologist. I was more interested in what media organizations and texts, programs, shows, etc., imagine children to be when they address them. So children as a textual effect, if you like. I was also interested in what researchers themselves imagine children to be using media for, and not necessarily simply by survey or psychological testing. It was more to do with how children enter society and join in collective social groups through means of media. And later, my research led me to the creative industries, much closer to policymaking, industry, and the productive use of creative media as a crucible of innovation, really. And here, children were conspicuous by their absence, and they're very rarely part of the conversation. So public policy and research seem to be focused on protection and correction, reducing children to effects of control culture, whereas I'm interested in children as collective cultural creators and innovators. I really moved pretty rapidly from Shakespeare to Kylie Minogue, and eventually onto Big Brother, where I got into a lot of trouble with the Australian media for comparing Big Brother with The Taming of the Shrew, which I thought was pretty convincing, but not everybody thought the same. And so I've been interested in that aspect of media performance, like how does it connect with the big questions of everyday life for whole populations in cultural circumstances, including love and marriage and death and lying and deceit and duplicity and self-advertisement and pride and arrogance. So all of those things are of great interest to children too. And it's that centered my attention on these things. Later on, I got to know an area, much more specialized area, called cultural semiotics through the work of an Estonian / Russian linguist and cultural theoretician called Yuri Lotman. And I'm proud to be a follower of Yuri Lotman, but not into the direction of strict formal semiotics and linguistics, much more following his amazing idea of the semiosphere as the precondition for speaking any language. And one of the characteristics of the semiosphere is that there must be more than one language in relation to each other, mutually untranslatable, maybe incommensurable, two forms of sense-making coming together, and actually communication takes place out of that difference. So there's a different theory of meaning, of language, of culture, and of the importance of looking at whole systems, not just individual utterances, to understand how things work in the sphere of culture. It leads to theories of adaptation, change, evolution, and complex systems in the abstract, but in the concrete, practical instance, it allows you to ask the question of what role do children play in such systems? What role do children play in the creation and reproduction of language and culture and society? And the conjecture that I've always felt to be intuitively worth pursuing is that they play a decisive role, that children make culture. I think this is an illustration of something that the French structuralist Claude Lévi-Strauss pointed out a long time ago, which is that when you overvalue something and undervalue it at the same time, it's a sure sign of taboo. Something's going on there which isn't really straightforward. And children are, one and the same time, undervalued because they're not noticed in policy. They don't get to take part in trials of medicines, for example, including the one that we're all interested in at the moment. But on the other hand, they're obsessively overrepresented in psychological studies of the effects of television. It's absurd. How do you relate the way that the sciences have understood children perhaps over-obsessed with their behavior and completely ignoring other aspects of their lives. What can you learn in that context from the humanities way of understanding children, which is really to do with, writing fiction or plays or drama or songs or whatever that they might enjoy? So on the one hand, you have Kylie Minogue singing and dancing, and everybody's favorite trooper. And on the other hand, you have the behavioral sciences saying, the effect of television is very bad for children. So, where does it stand? What's it about? And that question is as much a theoretical one as it is a question about children. It's about theory. How do we theorize? And theory, it seems to me, this is the punchline. Theory is the difference between science and storytelling. So theory is itself a story, and it needs to be understood as part of the process of making ideas work. But science has kind of cut it out of its own self-representation and pretends not to tell stories. It pretends to tell something else. So I think the changes in the way that the disciplines are operating must be to bring science and storytelling back into closer contact. When I started, I was very much part of that critical cultural studies environment that was also very affected by continental theory, postmodernism, and so on, which I do not disavow. I think it has very valuable insights to offer for the way we think. And yet at the same time, I was interested in conflict and struggle rather than in evolution and change, let's put it that way. And so lately I've come to take much more notice of the systemic or systematic aspect of social life. And so really I think the concepts that I'm now working with start from what is not children for, but what is culture for. So what is culture for? Culture could be, you could answer that question so many ways, and people have over so many years. But here's one simple way of answering it. Culture makes groups. You learn the language of your family or your residential area, your place, and you become one with, identified with, part of, related to all the meanings, the stories, the folklore, the religion, the statecraft, the economics of that group. And culture makes those groups. That's what it's good for. It bonds people together in meaningful relationship groups. And many of these groups split off and turn into something different, and then they may well come into conflict. So culture makes groups, but that's not the end of the story because nobody belongs to just one group. And so there's this interaction among groups and the way in which groups contend or compete for preeminence in particular circumstances. So there's an important place, not only for culture making groups, but for culture being the place where untranslatable, incommensurable difference is navigated, negotiated, conflicted over, fought over. And that is where knowledge comes from. New ideas come from those encounters between incommensurate groups. An area that's now known as biosemiotics, which is the idea that life as a whole, right down to the cellular, microbiological level, up to the more complex forms of life, is coterminous with signs. So all of the things that are alive create and share and use information, and all the things that are dead don't. So the idea that life and signification, life and communication, life and semiosis are one and the same is a very interesting idea. And I think if we want to pursue it, you can't just say, well, it is or it isn't just like that. You have to pursue the idea. If you want to do that, then the role of children in developing signification and information and communication is crucial, because that's how you learn to reproduce the society, the species, the organism. the field of children's studies in relation to media is so dominated by the behavioral sciences, and in that context by individualist psychology and a certain branch of sociology, but not all of it. There is such a monopoly on the way in which we are taught to think about children in that context that anybody who's not in that field is not in the field. And so I'm not in the field because I don't come from that tradition. And I work to some extent in opposition to it. There is a lot of criticism of individualist psychology. It's been around for a long time. I'm not the first to have discovered it. But the issue that kind of occupies you and me here is, well, what effect does that have on our knowledge of children? And the effect is that it helps people who are doing a certain kind of science to develop another fiction, a complete construction of the mind that does not exist in nature as such, or as observed, or as described. And that is the mind. And so they universalize the mind. They look at children as an example of that universal entity, and then discuss aspects of their behavior as a result. And that's really to do with the scientific method, the tradition of scientific method that is very cautious about meaning and identity and relationships and stories, but very confident about evidence and observation and things. Well, I don't buy any of that. I don't buy any of it. I think, evidence, observation, and things are as much a part of the story we tell ourselves as our stories. And so I don't feel that I'm in the field. I think that there's a time now with digital media, globalized media, and the kind of conversations that you and I can have across such distances. I think there's a time to say, well, technology, culture, and I don't know, meaning, need to be understood through more than one lens. You need to be able to say, yes, we need a science of the observation of these media, but you also need to understand what they're doing in terms of telling stories and so on. I think the time has come, as I keep saying, that we stop the suspicion of culture, stop the suspicion of storytelling and of delusion, illusion, religion, all these things, and start trying to understand what they're for. What do they do? What are they about? Why do people live and die for them? Certainly they do. So I think in current times, in the way that international politics is falling out, these become extremely important questions, and both science and culture have questions to answer. It's not just a matter of, shut up, the scientists explain, and us culturalists, crawl away and die. It's not like that. We have to have a conversation. The term deviance. What is deviance? Deviance is creating something new. Deviance is going away from what you've inherited. Deviance is breaking the rules. And if that isn't done, a culture will stagnate and be destroyed. Everybody knows that. So why do we come down so hard on deviance among the young, among children? And why do we associate that deviance with what they do with media and with devices and with technology? All that needs to be thrown out of the window and say that it's not deviance, it's innovation. My empirical research is the study of texts. I study very uncertain, very slippery, very contingent and movable sorts of entities. There's no such thing as a meaning. And so the very meaning of what's empirical is a bit different in my field from what it is in another field, where there are very strict protocols and rules devoted to what counts as evidence. Well, in my field, it's the attempt to discover what the rules are for setting rules that counts as evidence. And so, we're a kind of meta discipline in some ways. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but we're looking for models of culture, models of relationships, models of process in which you can try and understand how people make sense of things. And that's got to be uncertain, it's got to be contingent, and it's got to be relative. because that's how the world works in that context. Which isn't to say that we despise evidence, and it isn't to say that you shouldn't use evidence in drawing out your theories. But if theory and evidence are not integrated, then you don't get anywhere. The way I think of it is, if you're thinking, what are the rules that set the rules, then you have an opportunity to understand systems as a whole and how they are operating, where they might need system change, and how they are successful or not successful in various tests. I think there's a problem where the context, no, not the context, the ground of policy and public affairs and even education, where the very ground of it has been taken by government for instrumental purposes. And I don't mean the government, I mean governmentality, for their purposes, for instrumental purposes, for productive purposes, for defensive purposes. There's a problem with the idea that our research always ought to have instrumental outcomes. I don't think it should. I think we need to know how instrumental outcomes are produced first. When did science start taking an interest in women? Well, when it thought they needed some kind of governance or correction or protection, you know, that women were always understood as vulnerable. Women were always understood as a bit flighty. You know, they might read novels and bad things happen, as one of the Kellogg brothers thought in the 19th century. And there's this kind of discourse of control, protection, correction that comes into the study as a kind of given, taken for granted. And I think the very same discourse applies to children. They're the last group within our own society. People are still allowed to hit them in various contexts, and we treat them as if they have no rights, they're not citizens. And people feel very aggrieved if the way they've decided to treat their children is not accepted by society at large. So what I'm trying to get at is that governmental treatment of subjects, citizens, whatever, is already theoretical. And my job as a theorist is to open that up, sometimes to contest it, but certainly to try and understand how it works through culture, language, discourse, and storytelling. I think one of the lessons of the work that I've been doing around children's activism is that there needs to be a fairly serious attention to what it is that they're trying to say. And one of the most popular slogans of the Fridays for Future, School Strike for Culture, and Extinction Rebellion protesters is change the system. And I really agree with that. I think that there is in the future, we're going to have to think systematically, think in terms of the planet, think not what's this country or this gender or this class or this ethnicity going to need and have to defend itself with, but what does that have as an overall effect for humanity and thence for the planet, for the biosphere and the geosphere as a whole. And we just haven't started asking those questions properly yet. So where to now, planet, question mark, is where what we ought to be thinking about next. That's the theory of the future. And children have already started thinking about it. And so I think children are the theorists of the future because they spend their childhood creating communities among themselves around both song and dance on the one hand and political ideas that attract them, not that are received from above. On the other. So they are very active in a citizen sort of way and very active in a cultural sort of way among each other, using digital media across the world without regard to country or class. And quite often not even with regard to language, because pop culture, for example, circulates without any respect for language. Look at BTS, you know, I mean, you don't know what they're singing, but everybody in the world loves it. So the first time that we're able to think of ourselves in a planetary environment of connected meanings is exactly where children live. And so I think the theories of the future need to be working in that context with those ideas that are coming through. And those ideas are about climate justice, they're about waste and the uselessness of much of the productive work that we do. And I think there are lessons to be learned there. Well, in terms of theory, method, and children in relation to digital media, I think evidence is like children. It involves waste, manipulation, time, control, nurture, and it points to the future, but it's easily destroyed. And children are like evidence. They are both real and textual, both social and mediated, both cultural and political. So we should care for texts and meanings as we care for children when we're doing the kind of research that we're doing. And that's what cultural science is for.